Morning to you all. I would like to inform you that the disclosure of this session will be ensured by broadcasting on the web TV of the Chamber of Deputies. Remote participation is also possible for senators and members of Parliament in accordance with the Regulation Committee's measures. Today we will be having an informal hearing with Professor Ira Helfand on issues linked to nuclear disarmament. On behalf of President Minardo and colleagues of the Foreign Affairs and Defence Commissions, I greet and thank Professor Helfand for taking part in this hearing, and Dr. Liva Malcagno, person in charge of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureates Forum that brings together individuals and organizations that have received the Nobel Prize Award. I would like to recall that Professor Helfand is co-founder and co-chairman of the Organization for IPPNW and member of the board of the ICANN campaign. Both have received a Nobel Prize for Peace. Currently, the situation marked by growing and alarming tensions, geopolitical tensions that seem to push humanity towards disaster and into a global conflict. Today's hearing is a precious opportunity for dwelling on the issues of disarmament. And I point out that on the 12th of July 2023, the Foreign Affairs Committee approved unanimously Resolution 800021, signed with the first person signing this was Mrs. Boldrini. And this commits the government to continue with renewed intensity all of its efforts towards the objective of a world that is free from nuclear weapons, strengthening the protagonism of Italian diplomacy in this direction, and making concrete shared proposals, especially in the European Union and at the bilateral level with the main partners of Italy. Continuing the diplomatic action aimed at preserving the instruments for limiting and controlling nuclear weapons, and starting the negotiation of setting caps on nuclear deterrence, including also the states that have in full swing ambitious programs for rearmament, like the People's Republic of China, and continue to assess in this context, consistently with the obligations of the Atlantic Alliance and with other allies, consider possible actions to pick up the contents of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And having said this, I pass the floor to Professor Helfand so that he can deliver his presentation. Some colleagues other colleagues will be joining us soon, but there are also colleagues who will be listening remotely. So, Professor Helfand, you have the floor.
Good, thank you. First, let me apologize that I have to speak to you in English this morning. I do not speak Italian, and I thank you very much to the translators for making this possible. Second, thank you very much all for coming to this briefing and to those who have arranged it. I know that you understand this is not going to be a pleasant conversation that we have this morning, but I think it is a very important and necessary one. I have basically a few simple messages that I would like to share with you. Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Sorry. A few messages that I would want to share with you this morning. First, we need to understand that the danger of nuclear war is greater than it's ever been. This is not a problem that went away 40 years ago, as we like to think. Secondly, we need to understand that if there is a nuclear war, it is going to be far worse than we can possibly imagine. Third, we need to understand that this doesn't need to happen. This is within our control. We can decide if nuclear weapons are going to be used or not. And finally, I would want to emphasize the important role that Italy and other members of NATO can play in helping to prevent this ultimate catastrophe. So let me begin by looking at why I say that we are closer to nuclear war than we've ever been. This is an assessment that was offered 6 years ago now by the former United States Defense Secretary William Perry, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, before many things which have happened since then. He is a very serious and sober person. He was not being alarmist. He was describing accurately the situation in the world today. And the situation has become even more dangerous with the Russian invasion of Ukraine in particular. There are a number of reasons why we are so close to nuclear war. First and foremost is the deterioration of relations between NATO on the one hand and Russia on the other, which are the worst they have been since the end of the Cold War, and getting worse as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues. Second, but that's not the only geopolitical flashpoint that we need to be concerned about, relations between the United States and China are the worst they have been since the 1970s, and there's potential conflict, military conflict, over Taiwan, over navigation in the South China Sea. Third, the situation in Korea has again become extraordinarily volatile, and there's grave danger of the Korean Peninsula falling into a conflict which would quickly escalate to the use of nuclear weapons. Fourth, there is a situation in South Asia where India and Pakistan confront each other, where there is fighting almost every day, low-level fighting, but fighting almost every day on the border in Kashmir. These countries have fought 4 large-scale wars. They almost went to war twice in 2019. They both have large nuclear arsenals, and if there is another war in South Asia, it will be a nuclear war. And now, of course, we have the conflict in the Middle East, which was not anticipated, but which has destabilized the entire region and threatens to involve other powers outside the region which are nuclear armed. In addition to these geopolitical factors, there are 2 other considerations that we need to be aware of. First of these is the development of cyber technology, which has made the possibility of cyber terrorism greater. We used to think that in terms of terrorism and nuclear weapons, the principal concern was that a terrorist group might obtain a single nuclear bomb and use it to attack a city. What we now understand is that the greater danger is that a terrorist group, or for that matter a state party, could hack into the command and control systems of a nuclear power and directly launch their nuclear weapons, or perhaps more likely, trigger a false alert, trick the country that is being hacked into believing that it is under attack, and trick it into launching its own nuclear weapons in retaliation. And finally, we need to consider the role that the climate crisis plays in all of this. All of the nuclear weapon states claim that it is their goal, excuse me, to eliminate their nuclear weapons eventually when the world is safer. But the world isn't getting safer, and it's the climate crisis which is making it a more dangerous place. And as that crisis continues to unfold over coming decades, and it will, no matter what we do today to try to limit the extent of the climate crisis, as it unfolds, large portions of this planet will have difficulty supporting their human populations. This will cause conflict within societies as people fight over scarce resources of water and food. It will cause conflict between countries. It will cause migration on a scale that we have never seen in human history, which far dwarfs the migration that causes so much political turmoil today. And if nuclear weapons are on the table as all of these conflicts unfold, they're going to be used. So for all of these reasons, we have to understand that Secretary Perry was correct. We are closer to nuclear war than we've ever been. And we need to start acting as though that is the case, because we're not today. The entire global community is sleepwalking into this conflict, much as the world walked sleepily into World War I. There was no intention by anyone to fight that war, but it ended up consuming Europe. And we are in the same behavior pattern today, walking towards a nuclear conflict and not even understanding that's what we're doing. So let me turn for a minute and talk about what's going to happen if there is a nuclear war. Because even as we have forgotten that this danger exists, we have forgotten how horrible it will be. I want to start by describing a large-scale war between the United States and Russia. And I want to start that conversation by talking about what a modern-day nuclear attack would look like. Many of us, excuse me again, many of us, thank you, have seen pictures of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Many have visited there. And the destruction in Japan in 1945 is an important warning of what nuclear weapons can do. But the main thing that we need to understand is that Hiroshima and Nagasaki do not begin to prepare us for the kind of destruction that modern nuclear weapons would cause. If the United States and Russia go to war, it's not going to be one small Hiroshima-sized bomb on one city. It's going to be many bombs on many cities. And most of those bombs will be anywhere from 6 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. I tried to describe what this would look like. A major city like, say, New York or Moscow or perhaps Rome, would be targeted with probably anywhere from 6 to 10 to maybe as many as 20 nuclear warheads. Again, each of them 6 to 50 times more powerful than Hiroshima. I use a model to try to describe this. It's a 20 megaton bomb, much larger than the weapons that would be used. But the destruction that I'm going to describe is actually an underestimate, because you cause more damage if you use many smaller bombs than if you use one big bomb. But it's kind of hard to describe that, so the model of a single very large explosion, I think, serves our purposes. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this bomb, a fireball would form, reaching out for 3 kilometers in every direction, 6 kilometers across. Within that territory, everything would be vaporized. The buildings, the trees, the people, the upper level of the earth itself would disappear. To a distance of 6 kilometers in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 1,000 kilometers per hour. Mechanical forces of that magnitude destroy anything that human beings can build. This building, this gorgeous palace, would disappear. To a distance of 9 kilometers in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 25 kilometers in every direction, the heat would still be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Wood, plastic, cloth, gasoline, heating oil, it would all ignite. Hundreds of thousands of fires, which would join together over the next half hour into a firestorm, 50 kilometers across. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 800 degrees centigrade. All of the oxygen would be consumed, and every living thing would die. In the case of New York, 12 to 15 million people. In the case of Moscow, 9 to 10 million people. In the case of Rome, several million people. And if this were part of a large-scale war between NATO and Russia, this kind of destruction would take place at every major city in all of these countries. Within one afternoon, something like 2 to 3 to perhaps 400 million people would die. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure of all the countries involved in this conflict would be destroyed. There would be no electric grid. There'd be no cell phones. There'd be no internet. There'd be no system for distributing food. There'd be no law and order. And in the months following this attack, the vast majority of people in all of the affected countries who did not die on the first day would also die from starvation, from radiation poisoning, from epidemic disease. But I've only talked so far about what happens in the countries that fight the war. This conflict would be a disaster for the entire planet. The firestorms caused by this conflict would put 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere, blocking out the sun and dropping temperatures across the entire planet an average of 10 degrees centigrade. In the interior regions of Eurasia and North America, the temperatures would drop 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. This is cooler than we have seen on this planet since the last ice age 18,000 years ago. And under these conditions, all of the ecosystems which have evolved since the end of the ice age would collapse. Food production would stop. And according to a study that was published in the journal Nature in August of 2022, 3/4 of the human race would starve to death in the first 2 years. 5 to 6 billion people, including almost the entire population, 59 million people here in Italy. But that same study showed also that it is not just an all-out war between NATO and Russia that poses a threat to the planet. Even a much smaller war, involving as few as 250 of the 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world today, a war that could be fought, for example, between India and Pakistan, would also cause widespread, profound climate disruption. Not as bad as in a larger war between NATO and Russia, but still large enough to trigger a global famine that would kill, again, in just the first 2 years, 2 billion people worldwide, including 23 to 30 million people here in Italy. This is the danger that we face. And this is the danger that we live with every day that we allow these weapons to continue to exist. Even if no one ever makes a deliberate decision to launch a nuclear war, there is always the danger that we will stumble into one by accident. We know of at least 6 occasions during the nuclear weapons era when we came within minutes of nuclear war because of a false alert. On several of these occasions, either Moscow or Washington actually began the process of launching their nuclear weapons, only to stop at the last minute when it became clear that this was a false alarm. This existential threat hangs over us today, but it is not the future that must be. Nuclear weapons are not a force of nature over which we have no control. We have built these weapons with our own hands. They are little machines. The average nuclear warhead is about the size of the chairs we're all sitting in. We've already dismantled some 50,000 of these weapons. We know exactly how to do it. All that is missing is the political will to dismantle the 12,000 nuclear warheads that remain. And that is where we all come in, because we need to create that political will. The defense policies, the security policies of all the nuclear weapon states and the NATO states that live under the US nuclear umbrella, these policies are based on the assumption that somehow or other nuclear weapons make us safe, that they possess some magical quality that guarantees they'll never be used. We need to understand that there's nothing magic about nuclear weapons, that in fact they will be used, and that in fact, far from making us safe, they are the greatest threat to our security and to our survival. And we need to work now to eliminate them completely. We need to change the entire conversation about nuclear weapons. We need to place this at the center of the political discourse in every country that is involved with these weapons. And we need to look back and I think take some inspiration from what happened the last time we were approaching nuclear war in the early 1980s. In the summer of 1983, the United States placed Pershing missiles in Germany with the stated intention of being able to destroy Moscow in 6 minutes to fight and win a nuclear war in Europe. It was a totally insane proposition, but it was the official policy of the United States and NATO at that time. Millions of people took political action to prevent this from happening. They understood the danger, and they determined that they would not let this take place. And in less than 2 years, President Reagan and President Gorbachev sat down and said, nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought. It was a 180-degree change in the nuclear policy of both the United States and the Soviet Union. And it is something that no one expected could happen just 2 years before that. So we need to recreate that same level of intense opposition to nuclear weapons and bring about a similar change in nuclear policy today. And we can do it. We know we can do it because we've done it once before. So we are only asking ourselves to do again what we've already done. Now, I want to close by talking about the role that Italy can play in all of this. I think it is unlikely that any of the countries which possess nuclear weapons are going to sign the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the vehicle which has been created to bring about a nuclear-free world, unless they all do it together. So they need to sit down and negotiate the details that are not included in the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the timetable, the verification mechanisms, the enforcement mechanisms. But countries that are allied with them, like the countries in NATO, like Japan, Australia, South Korea, can play a major role in this process by themselves signing and joining the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and helping to shift the entire conversation away from this false belief that nuclear weapons make us safe to a realization that we must eliminate these weapons. It would have a profound impact on the United States, on the United Kingdom, on France, and I think also on China and Russia, if states in NATO said, this must stop. Your policies are leading us to disaster, and they must stop now. And so I would urge the Italian Parliament to consider requesting the government to sign the treaty and submit it for ratification. And I hope that Italy can join with other countries in NATO in providing leadership that is sorely needed in the world today. We have a very stark choice before us. You know, it says in the Hebrew Bible that God said, I've set before you life and death. Therefore choose life that you and your children might live. That is the choice literally before the entire world today. And we better make the right choice, because if things go wrong once, everything is over, and everything that we care about will disappear. The positive aspect of this situation is that eliminating nuclear weapons is a relatively simple task. It's not as complicated as dealing with a climate crisis. It doesn't require that everyone change the way they live. It doesn't require a fundamental reorganization of the economy. It simply requires one political decision and a very simple technical act of dismantling these warheads. But the process of reaching that agreement can provide a model for how nations must cooperate to deal with the other problems we're facing as well. It can show us the way to deal with the climate crisis, to deal with the next pandemic when that arrives. And so I think that while this is an enormous challenge before us, there's also a great opportunity to move the entire human community towards a new set of relationships based on cooperation rather than competition, so that we can deal with all the other problems that we face as well. Again, I just want to emphasize the urgency of this moment. It is very hard for us to understand how dangerous things are. I talk about this issue all the time. I know what's going to happen if there's a nuclear war. I know how close we are to having one. But in my heart, I don't believe it will happen. You know, I walked here this morning from where I'm staying in Trastevere through this beautiful city, and it's just impossible to imagine it all disappearing. But it will. And all the other great cities will disappear also. And somehow or other, we have to make ourselves understand that. We have to believe in our hearts that this danger exists so that it will lead our action. And if we do that, I think we can be successful, and I think we quite literally can save the world. And that's a pretty good thing to do. So thank you very much for letting me speak with you this morning. If there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, and I certainly welcome your comments about this situation.
Grazie,
Thank you, Professor Helfand. I would like to ask my colleagues if they have any questions or comments so that Professor Helfand can answer. Honourable Balsani. I would like to thank Professor Helfand for being with us this morning and for responding to our invitation, because the things that he has shared with us are extremely important. They have a symbolic value, but above all, he has also invited us to take some important actions, because there is an important gap between the nuclear action that is possible and the defense of people's these are two things that are on the two sides of the same coin, let's say, and we need to be very careful about and pay close attention to the words that we have just heard. Professor Helfand, well, my question is this. Professor Helfand says that we need to exercise some pressure at the international level, at world level, on Russia and between China and the United States, so that in some way or another we may bring this pressure to bear on Russia in order to lead to disarmament. I would like to understand if this is the best path or if there is any other solution, any other possibility, and in particular, what do you think in terms of a time horizon and also the merits of what can be done, because this can help us go in that direction besides signing the treaties, as you have just invited us to do. Please speak slowly, Professor, when you answer. Honorable Boldrini. Thank you, Madam Chairperson, and I would like to thank Professor Helfand for being here with us this morning. I wanted to congratulate Professor Helfand on obtaining and receiving the Nobel Prize in 2017 with the I Can campaign, and for also the treaty, bringing to fruition the treaty, which seemed to be impossible. But this shows that when civil society comes together and is united and acts, then unimaginable results can be achieved. This is the very sense of democracy, ultimately, the principle of subsidiarity, whereby civil society strengthens democracy and takes the initiative in order to improve it. So, Professor Helfand, Italy does not produce military weapons, but on its territory it does have nuclear weapons, nuclear warheads, B6112, that are a new generation weapons that are present on the Italian territory, in particular at Gedi, at the bases of Gedi and Aviano. So this is an issue that concerns us very closely and that must prompt our concern. Nuclear war, as you say, cannot be managed because when the bomb was launched on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, there was only one country that had that bomb, and that was the United States. Today, there are 9 countries, and amongst these countries, there are tensions. So, reaching, as you have well explained, this could extinguish humankind on Earth, and it could alter the environment so much that the environment would no longer be possible to produce what is necessary for the survival of human beings. So we have the duty as members of parliament to be totally involved on this issue. The Chamber of Deputies, as the President has just said, approved unanimously a resolution which commits the government to do things, but unfortunately it was asked to look into the possibility of sending an observer to the New York conference for the abolition of nuclear weapons, the second meeting, and Italy did not send the observer, unlike other countries, members of NATO, that instead did send an observer. Now, we listened to Ibakusha, the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs, and we also tried to invite them to come here. And I will continue to do this because we have also set up a parliamentary intergroup for the abolition of nuclear weapons. And we would like to invite the survivors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima to come and speak of their experience. But it seems to be difficult to get this idea through to public opinion. It is as if public opinion were not interested in being involved at this point in time in Italy, at becoming committed, at engaging in the denuclearization of weapons, and concerned about the risk of nuclear weapons and the fact that nuclear deterrent does not make us safer, as you have just said. deterrence is not safety, but it is the wrong investment of resources in a very dangerous area. So I would like to ask you, you have a global vision, an overview, a general vision. What can we do to involve public opinion more and to make it aware of the risks that we are living, even in our country? Because the military experts tell us that if we were to reach this situation, there is a protocol whereby those who have nuclear weapons would be hit first in order not to be hit back. And so before launching the weapon towards a preset target, so we are all at risk. So can you speak to us of some positive experience as to how we can involve people more? What instruments can be used? What sort of messages can we address to our young people who are engaged in protecting the environment? But the protection of the environment is closely intertwined with the nuclear threat. So how can we get this message across to our young people and involve them more on this issue? Because what I see is that it is really difficult to do this, to accomplish this. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Boldrini. Now, Honorable Fassini. I, too, would like to thank Professor Helfand. Now, Professor Helfand said one thing, which is the very heart of his thoughts, and that is that it is not technically difficult to dismantle nuclear weapons, but what is missing is political will. Now, what I notice right now, we are at a time of international anarchy, where the international institutions, with the United Nations first and foremost, are in a crisis, mainly, or first of all, because there isn't a concerted action and availability to a consultation of the great powers and nuclear powers in particular. And when there are wars, like the war in the Middle East, the war in the Ukraine, that are against the countries that hold nuclear weapons, then it is very difficult to have them sit around a table to decide to dismantle their nuclear arsenals. There are these difficulties. So I think that there's a consequence from this, and one of the reasons why we need to solve the conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East is this. So there aren't not only the direct reasons that induce us to say that we need to solve the conflict, but also the indirect aspects, like the aspects we're talking about here today, because for so long as the world is divided and those who have nuclear weapons are on opposite camps, it is difficult to reach an agreement to dismantle them. This is the first problem. And the second is this. You raised an issue which exists, namely, Europe must play an active role in this direction. Europe, in light of the international situation, is speeding up the construction of a European defense system, trying to supersede the national defense systems in favor of a European defense system. Now, the sensitive issue here, the sensitive point is that building up or establishing a relationship between this perspective, this position, and engaging Europe, as I think we need to do, in the fight against nuclear armaments. In the European Union, there is one country, there's a country that does have a nuclear weapon, which is France, and outside of the European Union, but in the European continent, there is Great Britain that has nuclear weapons. So I think that this is a very sensitive issue, I'm convinced of what you have said, what you have told us, and like all of our colleagues, we agree unanimously on the fact that we need to move towards denuclearization. But there are no doubts that, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, but without the possibility of there being a consultation of the large countries coming together, like China, Russia, the United States, of having them sit around a table. And then the issue as to how Europe holds together the construction of a defense system and a denuclearization system. Well, this isn't a problem that is solved. I think that what you have told us is extremely useful in order to induce us as representatives of the political world, and therefore with institutional responsibilities, to work to try and overcome these limitations or these limits. On the one hand, how we can speed up the solution to the conflicts underway by putting on the platform to solve these conflicts. Also the fact that in the post-conflict era, amongst the large countries, there should be a coming together for denuclearization. And secondly, we should wage a battle so that Europe may become aware of the fact that its European defense system must also be linked to its duty, to its engagement in denuclearization. I think that these are points that we need to bear in mind at the political level. Mr. Quartapelle, Mrs. Quartapelle, I too thank Professor Helfand for his presentation, which is very topical and interesting and useful. There is an issue that emerges also from what my colleagues have said so far, namely the risk that this stage of international disorder might entail a greater incentive to nuclear proliferation. The fact that Ukraine, with the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, renounced its nuclear warheads, provided that its territory be recognized by Russia, and that now this has been ignored, and that renouncing the nuclear weapons has led to the fact that Ukraine has been invaded twice since 1994. So the incentive towards nuclear proliferation is increasing and not decreasing. And this is something that generates great concern in us. We're bewildered. Even the worst regimes in the world, in order to be intangible, will take this race towards nuclear armaments. This is the tragedy that we are living right now. So what you have told us is extremely important, and your position is very important right now, because there is a responsibility for those who are thinking like we are every day as to what we should do to improve stability, international peace, and in order to build and strengthen an order based on law and not on strength. Well, the nuclear issue is at the very heart of all of our concerns. And with regard to this, I would like to ask a question which is worth $1 million, I think, or even more. How do you see this problem, and how can this problem be faced? Obviously, right now, the law of the fittest of the strongest seems to hold until Russia does not go back to within its borders. But how can we launch an extremely important message on towards denuclearization without this being perceived as being a weakness? We want to convey a message of stability, of order, and of well-being for the citizens of the world, and not only our citizens. And at times these aspects or these things seem to be in conflict with one another. Thank you. Are there any other requests for the floor? All right, then I would invite Professor Helfand to reply to the questions and ideas that have been presented.
Thank you for all of those comments and questions, which are not easy ones to respond to. I should emphasize, of course, that I'm not a diplomat, I'm a medical doctor. But but I will try to offer some thoughts at least. This is really, you know, I think in many ways the crux of the matter, these concerns that have been expressed by all four of you about how do we proceed at this current moment, given how anarchic the world situation is, given the threat posed by Russia, given the incentive apparently to some to have nuclear weapons, given what happened in Ukraine, and so on. I think the only way we're going to deal with this is by having everyone sort of step back and look at what is going to happen if we don't get rid of the nuclear weapons, because that really is the bottom line here. If we don't get rid of them, they're going to be used, and we're all going to die. That has to be the starting point of our conversation. And it's not at the moment. The starting point is all the little conflicts that are going on, and the competition between the various powers for influence. As long as we play that game, frankly, we are doomed, because we will not cooperate, we will not get rid of nuclear weapons. And you know, many people have the idea this is a very bad time to be talking about trying to bring about nuclear disarmament, given all of the terrible things that are happening. I think the only answer I have to that is to look back to the 1980s, and it is important for us to remember how terribly dangerous that moment was. The tension between the United States, NATO, and the Soviet Union was every bit as bad as it is now. The Soviet Union was involved in a war in Afghanistan similar to its current war in Ukraine. The United States was involved in a shadow war with the Soviet Union in Central America. There were hot conflicts between the nuclear powers, not quite as direct as Ukraine, but pretty close. In Afghanistan, there was a direct Soviet invasion. There was direct US support for the people who were opposing that invasion. And despite that, the leadership was able to understand the enormous danger that they were running by continuing to have nuclear weapons. I think that's the key here. We have to get to the leadership in these countries and help them understand that everything else that they're doing doesn't matter if they don't get rid of the nuclear weapons. And essentially that's what happened in the 80s. You know, Gorbachev and Reagan, who is not the brightest person in the world, were able to figure out that this is what's going to happen, that we have to change course. Now, I don't know exactly what the configuration of events would be here. I don't expect that Putin is going to play the same leadership role that Gorbachev played. I think the United States and China perhaps will be the key to this. They are the two largest powers in the world today, and neither one of them has any interest at all in having a nuclear war. It would be disastrous for both of them. And their leaders ought to be able to understand that. And so I think that really is the key in many ways, is to get the United States and China to come together on this issue. And if they do, if the leadership of both countries could decide correctly that the world must be free of nuclear weapons, I think they can bring the other countries along with them. Is this going to happen? We can't know. All we can know is what's going to happen if we are not successful in this effort. So we need to try at least. The Honorable Signora Quattrapelle, scusi, you know, raised the question of does this show weakness if we try to do this? I don't think it does. I don't think it showed weakness when Gorbachev and Reagan sat down together and faced reality. I think it shows realism. And I think, you know, we can, for example, I live in the United States. Our efforts there are to get the US government to reach out to the other 8 nuclear-armed states and propose negotiations on this. I think that would show leadership, not weakness, and it would show this strength and confidence of someone who knows that they understand the situation. So I think that's really, that's the way that this can go forward. We can't know if it will be successful, but I think that there is a path that we can see that we should try to follow. And the role of Europe in this, I think, is to encourage that process, both privately, by encouraging, whenever possible, the leadership of China and the United States to sit down and talk, and publicly by taking steps like signing and ratifying the TPNW, which is the kind of step that would really get significant attention. The situation, as suggested by the Honorable Signora Fassini, clearly the fact that the world is so fragmented today makes this process even more difficult. It was perhaps easier when it was just the East Bloc and the West Bloc in the 1980s. But that's the world we live in. We have to try to deal with that situation as best we can. In terms of, I think, what may be the most important question that was raised by Signora Baldrini, how do we get this conversation going? Because that really is the issue. What distinguishes today most dramatically from the 1980s was the degree of awareness about the nuclear threat that existed then, which doesn't exist today. And I think this is our job, is to create that awareness. We remember the huge demonstrations in 1982 against nuclear weapons. What we don't remember is that in 1979, 1980, there was no movement against nuclear weapons. It was built over the course of 2 years by people educating the public about this danger. And in the United States, much of our effort is directed at the Congress, not because the Congress will make the ultimate decision, but because members of Congress can become powerful public champions for this message. They can use their position in government to get the attention of the press, to get the attention of the public. And I would hope that members of the parliament here in Italy would be able to do the same thing, as I know you all have been trying to do. It can feel somewhat frustrating because we are not making as much progress as we would like. But I think the only path forward is to continue with these efforts to educate the public. And I'm actually quite happy to see in the United States that there has been, over the last several months, a real change in the public discussion of this issue. For the first time, major institutions, major media players are calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons, which they have not done before. The New York Times has a current series of editorials that will play out over the entire year, calling for the abolition of nuclear weapons. The former Secretary of Energy in the United States, Ernest Moniz, whose department was responsible for building and maintaining the U.S. nuclear arsenal, has called in an op-ed piece in the Los Angeles Times for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. The Boston Globe, the large newspaper in the city I live in, which has never had this position before, has now called for the abolition of nuclear weapons. So something is changing. And some progress clearly and this has all been in the last month or so. So I think that there is the potential to move public opinion if we just keep doing our work, presenting the facts to the public whenever we can, and taking advantage of the platform, the position that you have as members of Parliament to reach the public. I'm just looking to see if there are any other points that were raised that I haven't tried to speak to. Oh, just one other point that I would make. In terms of relationship to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there are important provisions in the treaty that talk not just about the elimination of nuclear weapons to prevent nuclear war in the future, but also trying to address the harm that has already been done by the nuclear enterprise, the victims of testing, the victims of uranium mining. These are aspects of the treaty that Italy could engage with today, even without signing the treaty. A number of countries have entered into the conversations around how best to provide medical care to the victims already existing of the nuclear enterprise. And I think that would be something that to really encourage. The Italian government could take part in these conversations, in these meetings, could help to work out plans for ameliorating the environmental damage and the human health risk and the human health damage that has already occurred. And that would be a useful step in bringing Italy into this conversation. Thank you.
Prego, onorevole Fassino.
Honorable Fassino. Well, the professor has, in his presentation, provided some very specific data. Could we have the text of your presentation, or could we have some more detailed information, because you laid out a number of figures and facts and so on, so could we have those?
Yes, I'd be happy to try to provide some written materials that can be distributed. I would particularly reference the really important article that was published in Nature in August of 2022, which looks in great detail at the climate effects and famine that will follow a nuclear conflict. I think that really is the heart of the matter at this point. You know, we used to worry primarily about radiation, and that is still a huge issue if nuclear weapons are used. But it turns out that the climate disruption and famine that follow a nuclear war dwarf all other effects in terms of the numbers of people affected. And let me just also mention was made of how do we reach out to the climate activist community. And I think that this is a really important point for us to understand. Most young climate activists know nothing about nuclear war. Most young people don't. When they learn about it, they're very concerned. And in terms of the climate activist community, there's this very direct link. The climate crisis is driving us towards nuclear war. There are many experts who think that is the way the climate crisis will have its primary negative impact, by triggering a nuclear war. And if there's a nuclear war, its primary impact will be achieved through climate disruption. So there's a very, very close connection between the climate crisis and the nuclear danger. And we need to help the climate community understand that, so that they will turn the energy which they have towards this issue as well. It's unfortunate that especially for young people who are already feeling somewhat overwhelmed by one existential threat, that we need to tell them that there's a second one. But we do. This is the truth. This is the reality.
Grazie, Professore.
Thank you, Professor. Thanking you for your authoritative contribution. You have given an important contribution to our activities, and you have given us input also for our future work. And with this, I